this feels comfortable, this doesn't, and then kind of unpack as to why. And what has been really interesting is that there's a fair amount of you that are coming in saying, hey, I have some high level discomfort, high level of tension in these particular movements. Some of you are saying pain as well. Some of you do have some health conditions that you're currently looking after and managing. All of these things are great. Now, what has been great to see you guys is really take hold of that learning process and start to look at different ways of testing, and then also start to figure out, like, what do I do once I've tested that and I have a result? And what do I do if that result isn't comfortable for me? How can I further test it? So you guys have probably noticed some symmetry with the squat, the ankle, things along those lines. I'm gonna dive into that in week 3 because we're gonna be specifically looking at the squat pattern. But what I do want to talk about, because you guys have probably been hearing a lot of me say mobility deficit, stability deficit, is I want to just kind of really define that a little bit more so that you guys have a better indication of what I'm talking about. So here's the cool thing about looking at movement screening, and of course joint screening as well, is that when we think about it, we've got these two words, mobility and stability. Now, mobility is a term that we throw around a lot in our industry. Now, the way that I like to define it and how the lens that I look through is that mobility can be really kind of one of two things, is we look at it on the joint level first, okay? So mobility can mean the joint, so how much usable range of a joint do we have, okay? What can that individual control? And what do they have access to? Because that's going to allow me to make sure that I program efficiently for that. The second thing is tissue, okay? So when I say tissue, I'm talking about the muscles. I'm also talking about the fascia. So the saran wrap that wraps around the tissue, connects to the bones, and innervates the tissue, okay? So tissue meaning flexibility, right? How much functional flexibility does somebody have working on the joint? So let's say the shoulder joint, shoulder to neck, shoulder to scapula, shoulder to elbow. What are the tissues that work with that joint, and how flexible are they? Okay, so that's looking at the pliability and elasticity of the tissue. So for mobility is very easy to see, because with the type of screening that you guys have just did, is it has a landmark that you have to hit. So you either hit it or you don't, right? And if you don't, then we can unpack that and we can have a deeper conversation of what that looks like. So mobility is actually really cool because you can see if somebody owns it or not, okay? Movement as well is also a really good indicator. So one of the things that we look at with testing and screening is major asymmetry. That's a red flag, whether that be right to left side, okay? We want to make sure that somebody has basic foundational movement, basic foundational patterning, okay? In the hinge, the squat, being able to push, pull, lunge, all of these things that neurodevelopmentally we've done for our entire life, okay? So these two things are really easy to be able to see. If you see somebody squat hunched over, you're probably going to say that's not an optimal squat. I probably want to look at breaking that out a little bit more. Same thing with the deadlift or whatever pattern we're working on. So these two are actually really, really simple to eyeball and observe. It's this baby right here that can be quite complicated. Stability. Stability is one of those terms that when we think of stabilization, we think of, you know, being able to have proper posture and be able to tensionally control something. Stability ideally is being able to control said range of motion and mobility in the presence of change. Whether that change be a change of direction, that change might be load or unloaded, something along those lines. It might be multi-directional versus isolated movement. So stability can be something that is a little bit more subjective, whereas mobility is, we can quantify that, right? If you can't touch your scapula in this particular pattern, I'm going to call that as non-optimal. Doesn't mean you can't do training. Doesn't mean you can't do push-ups, do pull-ups, any of those things. It just means that we may need to modify, and we may need to look at that a little bit deeper, right? Especially if there's high tension or pain. Stability changes in presence of a lot of other things other than just musculoskeletal movement, okay? And this is kind of something that I want to hit home. Now, as a group, we haven't taken an intake process. I haven't had you fill out my consultation forms and go over your medical history and your lifestyle and your, your stress management and all of those things. But you guys, of course, as coaches and trainers, will have your clients do that. So stability, when we're talking about movement, we use a term called motor control, which is improving motor control, like control of the movement, the nervous system, being able to influence the nervous system's reactivity so that movement improves. But this is really definable on how our body on the inside is working. So stability in regards to movement is going to be based on a few different things. It can be based on, my penmanship is not that great, sorry. So that can be sleep. If someone is sleep deprived, okay, their stability is going to be compromised, their mobility will be compromised, and their movement will be compromised. Because if you're not running on all cylinders, your body's going to put on the internal parking brake. And that internal parking brake is going to come in the physical manifestations of tension, stiffness, tightness, sluggishness as well, pain. So people that are routinely sleep deprived in chronic pain studies have an increase of pain by about 30%. So sleep can be an indicator, right? Water, hydration can be an indicator as well. Someone who's hydrated, they're not going to have pliable elastic tissues. They're not going to have joints that are lubricated well, right? Because their body's going to be shunning water to organs that need it. Which brings us to detoxification, right? If livers, kidneys, lymphatic system aren't doing their job well, then detoxification is going to be a little bit more challenging, right? So that's going to influence movement, that's going to influence mobility, and that's going to influence stability as well, okay? Stress as well. That's a big one. Most health conditions these days are related to overstress, and 74% of the population is dealing with some type of psychosomatic stress. I would say that's even more so now with COVID. But all of these things are going to influence stability. So why do I bring that up? I bring that up for two reasons. Number one, with your testing protocols, okay, with your testing over the course of last week, we're going to be doing mini tests for each one of the patterns, and then of course testing in week 6 for a rescreen, is I want you to consider where you found yourself being most challenged, okay? Not just the videos that you uploaded, but also what areas of movement were you feeling challenged? Where were you feeling that you didn't have as much mobility or stability? And then start to consider maybe if some of the lifestyle factors are playing into that. Now, obviously with being physically distanced and socially isolated a tad, we are spending more time sitting for the most part. We're not as active as we normally are. There is some stress there, obviously, for a lot of different reasons, personally, professionally, all of that. So we all have to take that into consideration. But if we take COVID out of the equation, then you also want to be considering that, because those are things that you're going to be looking at with your clients as well. Is if someone's coming in with a lot of stiffness, no matter what you're doing, tension, movement just isn't progressing, then the lifestyle factor is something we need to look at. Because if you can't modify the lifestyle, then it's going to be very challenging to make any gains in any of the fitness or health realms that the client is looking at. So I want you to consider what your sleep's like, what your hydration is like, your nutrition, what your stress is, those types of things, okay? So I'm gonna roll that back up. That brings us to the sort of today's. So I'm gonna go through a couple different things. We're going to look at basically hinge and deadlift, okay? So really kind of looking at these two. We're going to start to test the active straight leg raise, but before we do that, I want to get into a little bit of a presentation for about 5 to 7 minutes. Week 1 and week 2 have a little bit longer